All right, I think we are going to get started. So again, welcome everyone. Today is our webinar on parents and teen mental health, where we are joined by Dr. Neha Chaudhary. So Neha, thank you so much for joining us today. I know many of us are very eager to hear from your perspective on this very complicated and timely topic for many of us in the room. So thank you, Neha.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
Of course. This webinar is part of our free summer webinar series for parents. We are actually hosting a free webinar every 3 weeks. So definitely stay tuned for our upcoming webinars on similar topics. The webinar will be recorded. We have anonymized your questions, and we will stop the recording before we conclude with an open discussion. We have received many requests to record this session, given the interest, Neha, in this topic. And so one of the things that we do encourage you to do is we will be sharing the recording post-webinar. So please feel free to share with friends and community members. Great. The webinar is hosted by us at Daybreak Health. Our mission is building mental fitness in young people by creating universal access to effective mental health care. And our services are online counseling services designed for teens. Some of you on the call may be more familiar with our previous name, Elemental Health, but we are now Daybreak Health. Our agenda for today, we will start with a brief introduction on Neha and the team, and then I will give, again, a brief overview on anxiety and depression. We'll go through some common signs and symptoms, and then talk through some of the treatment options available. The bulk of our session today will be a Q&A with Neha. Thank you all for submitting very thoughtful questions to our webinar. We have organized those and categorized those so that Neha will be responding to them directly. We have 3 big categories that we're going to cover. The first is anxiety and depression. The second is family well-being. And the last is how to support your teen. Then Neha will transition into discussing a little bit more about Daybreak Health and our services. And as I mentioned previously, we will close with an optional open discussion. So if you have questions that went unanswered, please hang around after, and we will be available to answer your questions. So, Neha, introducing you here. Again, thank you so much for joining. Neha is a leading expert on adolescent mental health. She is a double board certified psychiatrist, actually focusing on child, adolescents, and adults, so spanning the full spectrum there. Neha is also a freelance writer. Her work has been featured in many publications, including the New York Times, ABC, Good Morning America, and many others. Neha additionally co-founded Stanford Brainstorm, which is a lab for mental health innovation. And Neha's research is a lot about using technology to provide mental health solutions for young kids. Given her research, there was a very natural synergy between Neha and Daybreak Health, and Neha is actually an advisor to the company. Neha's inputs have been super critical in devising our service offering here. When it comes to parents, Neha particularly likes to help parents raise healthier children by encouraging everyday activities that are easy to do. So we'll be learning more about those types of activities later on in the webinar. And then you have the 3 of us from Daybreak Health. My name is Anna Lazar, and I'm a program manager here. I focus on education and partnerships. We have Sid Sidambi, which many of you may have interacted with already, and likely post-interaction will be interacting with Sid as well. Sid runs business and operations for us at Daybreak Health. And then lastly, we have Alex Alvarado, who is our CEO. Great. So for this first section, again, I will be speaking to anxiety and depression. There were a few questions from this group on pretty fundamental, signs, symptoms, and treatment options. And so we thought it would be valuable as a group just to ground ourselves in some of this foundational information. So first off, for anxiety, what we have done as a group is collected typical signs and physical symptoms that we see with kids who struggle with anxiety. The one thing we did want to mention, both for anxiety and depression, is that we have a lot of different signs and symptoms here that cover a wide spectrum. And so what we encourage you to do is, if you're seeing some of these signs emerge in your teen that are different from what would be normal for your teen, that is a reason to sort of investigate and learn more about what's going on. But when we think about anxiety and typical signs, what we see is avoidance of social activities being pretty common, changes in academic performance, obsessive thoughts, worrying, irritability, mood changes and communicating less, changes in eating patterns, whether that be eating more or eating less, and then of course trouble sleeping. Recurring nightmares is also a common sign. From a physical symptoms perspective, we see headaches, stomach aches, or shortness of breath with no medical reasoning behind. There's also an interesting dichotomy between restlessness, fidgeting, and also tiredness and fatigue. Shaking, sweating, and intimidating situations is also common, in addition to muscle aches and tension. For depression, some of the typical signs that we see are persistent sadness, anger, irritability. Similarly, with depression, we see changing moods, increased sensitivity for depression, declining grades potentially, again, a loss of interest in activities, shutting down or isolating. Low self-esteem is also common, and changes in appetite. Insomnia, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, and then of course, substance use and self-harm. From a physical symptom perspective, we see headaches, slowing of movements, fatigue, and also aggression are common in teens. Now, Sid, I think we're ready for the poll portion. Go ahead.
Great. So, hi everyone. So, Anna just went over some signs of anxiety and some signs of depression, both in behavior as well as physical symptoms. What we wanted to do right now is something that we frequently do in webinars and that our attendees find very useful, which is just a quick anonymous poll to the audience to get some reactions to the content that we just showed. And the results of the poll will be shared with you, but the results will be anonymous. And I think there's a lot of value. We have a lot of people on the webinar today. There's a lot of value in sort of knowing, contributing, what your perspective is, and then also seeing the kind of aggregate perspective of the group. So I'm just going to launch that poll right now. And you will all see it on your screen. And so I would just ask that you take 1 second to, 1 minute, sorry, to just answer this poll. And the question is, have you recently noticed any of these signs of anxiety or depression recently in your teen? And I'll just give everyone a second to answer. We're about halfway there in terms of answers, so I appreciate it. Got about 10 votes remaining. Just give you 1 more second. Okay, I will end the poll now, and I will share the results with the group.
Great. So it looks like we have a pretty nice distribution here following across all of these, with most common being anxiety, obsessive thoughts, fatigue, avoiding social activities, or irritability. Also seeing a pretty significant group in the depression bucket, and then also about 40% in the no category. So we have kind of a wide spectrum of parent attendees. And so, that's really great. Neha will be covering in more detail anxiety and depression in the Q&A, but she will also have a section on general family well-being and communication, which I think can be valuable for the whole audience. So thanks, Sid.
Sure.
Now we're gonna just transition back to this intro section. This is a very common question that we see at Daybreak Health, and the question is how to really tell the difference between normal behavior or stress and what could be potentially deeper issues like anxiety and depression. So what we've done is we've come up with 3 main criteria to sort of help you make that decision and understand your teen's behavior more. The first is time duration, and this one is really critical. So with normal behavior and stress, signs and symptoms are occurring in response to a particular event or stressor. And after a few days, typically, those signs and symptoms will go away. When there is a deeper issue, for example, with depression, if you're seeing signs and symptoms for longer than 2 weeks, those could be signs that there could be depression going on. The second criteria is daily activities and functioning. Again, this one is super critical. So with normal stress, there is continued participation in daily activities, especially when we think across these 3 main categories of school, home, and social. And again, when there is a deeper issue, this likely will interfere with all 3 spheres here, and we will see teens pulling back. Lastly, of course, is symptom type and severity. So with stress, there are fewer symptoms and they're milder, whereas with deeper issues, you're going to see more symptoms collectively and also more severity with those symptoms. Great. So the last piece of this overview and introduction to anxiety and depression, we did want to cover what the treatment options are and how we think about different levels of care. So we have this first category, which is really wellness and prevention. This kind of care is really valuable for all of us in this category, things like meditation, nutrition, coping skills, actually like journaling, deep breathing, and music we see are very valuable in teens, and Neha will actually speak to some of those in the Q&A. The second category is what we call outpatient counseling and therapy. Daybreak Health does fit into both of these first sections, and this category is really for teens with mild to moderate symptoms who need a little bit of extra support. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, supportive therapy happen here. Then we move on to outpatient medication management. This is for teens with more moderate to severe symptoms who need additional support beyond the counseling and therapy provided. This is work typically done with psychiatrists and pediatricians in some cases. Lastly, we have more intensive care. And again, this is going to be teens for which the previous portion was not enough, likely, who need more support or where safety is a concern. And so we have different types of programs here, including intensive outpatient, day programs, and residential. So that is sort of a wrap up of, kind of a brief introduction that we wanted to start off with before we dive into Q&A. But now I will ask Neha to join me, and we will move into covering your pre-submitted questions. I did want to get started by thanking every one of you who submitted questions today. We received many, many questions and many very thorough and thoughtful questions. So thank you again. If by chance your question is not answered today, know that you can always reach us. Our email is hello@daybreakhealth.com, and we are happy to follow up with you if your question is not answered today. So the first section here, we had a lot of questions around anxiety and depression. And so what I will do with Neha is I will read out your questions, and then Neha, I will give you plenty of time to answer. So thanks, Neha. The first question we have here, how to talk to teens with anxiety. What are teens thinking and what to expect?
This is a very common question that parents ask. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one. So generally speaking, if you suspected that your teen might suffer from anxiety, you'll want to do two things. One, you want to learn more about what's going on. And number two, you want to figure out how to best support them. So to learn what they're experiencing, I first sit them down and very directly ask. A lot of parents are looking for signs and symptoms without directly opening up communication with their child, and that can go a long way. You might want to just ask generally how they're feeling on most days, ask if there's any change in how they're feeling as compared to how they normally feel, or perhaps how they felt before you noticed any of these new symptoms. You could try normalizing what's going on, saying that you've heard or read or seen from other people that a lot of people are experiencing anxiety right now, and see if that's something that they're going through as well. You really never know, because there might be something else going on. So you don't want to assume without asking. And then next, you want to figure out how to best support your kid, both at home, as well as finding them the right professional help if they need it. So if you find that the anxiety has persisted for some time and is not going away, or it's gotten to the point where your child is really having trouble functioning the way that they did, either with completing schoolwork or with their relationships, or just generally how they're doing at home, then it's likely time to get help. But in terms of what you can do at home, there are a couple things that are helpful for parents to know if they have teens with anxiety. One is that teens with anxiety might be more emotionally reactive or a little bit more sensitive in the way that they respond. The reason that I mention this to parents is it is helpful to know that sometimes there is something deeper going on, and the child isn't just trying to, give you attitude, or you're not doing something wrong as a parent. You could be doing everything right, and they may react in a way that looks different from how they used to react or normally do. Another tidbit that's also helpful to know for kids with or parents of teens with anxiety is that having structure, like a routine and consistency and predictability, can be really soothing for that anxiety.
Yeah, thank you, Neha. That's a really great recommendation, and again, a really popular question that we see. This next one is similar in that it talks about anxiety. My son becomes very anxious before an exam or any major test, or even before he starts something new. Due to this, he is unable to sleep, eat, and get stomachache. He is 17 years old.
So some of these symptoms are very common in anxiety, and if a child's struggling for a while, I really do suggest to parents that it might be time to get help, because otherwise your child just continues to suffer, and the anxiety can build upon itself over time. So for example, a child might get more and more anxious before each test because they remember getting anxious the last time, and they remember how that anxiety affected their performance, which leads to this cycle of anticipatory anxiety that just builds upon itself. So you really want to break those cycles before they get worse, which really looks like getting care early.
Great. This next question, what does it mean when your child picks their skin, bites his or her lip, and engages in cutting?
So skin picking can come from a few different places. It could be related to OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, where it's a specific compulsion that does require treatment, or it could be a form of self-harm, as can lip biting or cutting. So if a patient is engaging in self-harm behavior, or a teen or a parent comes to me saying that this is what's going on, it usually is a signal that they need professional help.
Is this just an age 16 thing? These teens are going through so much at this age with depression and anxiety. And is it a sign generally of the times that we're in?
I'm going to answer this with the next one too. I see the next one is, am I seeing a jump in teenage depression from stay-at-home lockdowns? I think the two kind of go hand in hand. So I do think that there is some element of being a teen that just lends itself to moodiness and ups and downs, especially after puberty. That said, there has absolutely been an uptick in actual depression and anxiety in recent times, possibly because there's some element of it just being on people's radars. So people are more likely to get help and they're being diagnosed more often. But I think there's also a lot of social changes that have happened that might be contributing. So for example, there's social media now that a generation ago wasn't using. There's increased pressures at school where the bar just seems to be getting higher and higher and higher. And then now the pandemic and everything with it. So it unfortunately has become a lot more common, and there are studies that have shown increased rates in recent years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Neha. This next question, addressing mild social anxiety. So teens getting clammed up or nervous to meet new peer groups, possibly to tears, but no other signs of anxiety. How to address these?
So there are some specific types of anxiety disorders that affect a very specific situation. So this is something that parents ask about a lot because they say, well, we don't really see the anxiety when it comes to all these other settings. So what is it that's going on? It could be that there's a particular phobia or fear of something specific, or it could be something called social anxiety disorder where the symptoms are only present in social situations. Whatever it is and whatever the specific type of anxiety is, there are a lot of types of therapies that are designed to specifically help with things like phobias, social anxiety, separation anxiety, as well as generalized anxiety. So it's definitely worth, I think, on this one, exploring professional help, especially if a child is brought to tears. Because I would say that that's a sign that they're suffering and they likely don't want to be feeling that way. So that to me is a sign to get help.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This next question is on teen depression. So how does teen depression translate into early adulthood? What are some of the signs?
So usually we call this early adulthood period transitional age youth, which is basically kids who are entering college and then the workforce. So basically they're not a minor anymore, but they're still in their late teens, early 20s. And I would say that depression generally looks pretty similar as it does in slightly younger teens in terms of what the person's experiencing from their perspective. But that said, given all the transitions, there might be some new signs to look for. So for example, a teen who's in high school might be able to hide their depression really well because overall they're getting through school okay, they're getting their homework done, they're holding it together socially. But then when they go to college, their grades drop because the demands are just that much higher. The coursework is harder, the depression is affecting their motivation. After that, they might not care about getting a job or find that things that really take a lot more focus and concentration and motivation and energy just become a lot harder. You might also notice substance use. So a lot of teens and young adults with depression that's left untreated for a while do have a tendency to self-medicate. So that's definitely something important to look for. But all of this said, on the plus side at this age, usually that normal push-pull that happens between parents and their teen is shaken up a little bit when kids leave home. So once they leave, they might be a little bit more willing to come back and communicate verbally with the parents about what's going on, rather than try to rebel and differentiate themselves. And also as they become older, they generally develop a little bit better of an ability to, I guess, describe how they're feeling with their quote unquote thinking brain versus just kind of acting with their emotional brain during the younger years. So I would say all in all, there are some transitions, but they're subtle. So it's a really good time to start communicating really proactively with that age group.
Great. That's really helpful, Neha. And I think from the questions, we have quite a few parents in this call who have teens who are about to undergo this transition. So I'm sure that advice is helpful for them. The last question for this topic is a big one, how social media contributes to depression and anxiety, and how to teach teens about self-control when it comes to things like screen time and social media.
Oh boy, this is a big one and one that's been on a lot of people's minds. So my thoughts on social media is that it really is a double-edged sword. So on one hand, it really has allowed people to share very useful information that they otherwise wouldn't have had access to. And it is a way to connect with many other people kind of with a new level of ease or convenience, including through the use of things like online groups. A lot of people join groups when they're looking for support or a way to connect, and they find information and connections there that they otherwise just wouldn't have access to. And that can all be really healthy. But with this also comes a whole new set of risks, right? So with all of these other additional components and risks that have entered the picture with social media, a lot of them I do think end up directly contributing to depression and anxiety. So for example, kids are constantly comparing themselves to others. They're feeling like they're potentially falling short of what's expected of them, which ends up in turn affecting self-esteem. Kids are bullying and being bullied by other kids. Kids are even sharing self-harm tips. And some of these are buried on some of the platforms with a seemingly benign picture, like it could be a picture of a flower or two people hanging out in a park smiling. But if you read the text, there's almost like these hidden or secret ways of sharing ways that they're cutting or self-harming in some way. There's also a lot of misinformation that's being shared. So people are not getting the right type of treatment and the right type of information. I've also heard from a lot of teens themselves and parents that they feel like kids are less focused on in-person connections because they're so focused on their online relationships. So they're less mindful of their surroundings and not developing their social skills in the same way. And then they also end up becoming very reliant on external validation, meaning what their peers think, what other people think. And they find or learn, they don't learn as well to find that validation from within or to self-soothe or to self-validate. Mm-hmm. So what parents can do is probably start by having a really candid conversation about it, saying, you know, I'm not asking you to get off social media. The whole world is using it right now, but I just wanted to understand how it is that you're using it and how it makes you feel and how it doesn't make you feel. So I've actually had many teens tell me directly that they didn't want to take a social media break, but for whatever reason they had to. Maybe it was a doctor's appointment. Maybe they were even hospitalized. Maybe they made a deal with their parents or got their phone taken away. Whatever it was, so many have told me that they didn't choose to do it, but once they had their phones away and or once they had no access to social media, they instantly felt better. They felt like a weight lifted off their chest, and they didn't realize how anxious or worried it was making them feel in some way. They had no idea until it was taken away. Yet, once they had their phones back or had the access back, they didn't want to stop. So it might be worth maybe doing some sort of family experiment, sitting down together and saying, hey, why don't we at least put our phones away for dinner every night, or however many times a week you guys might be able to sit down and eat together, if at all possible. Or maybe we can do another 30-minute period of your choice at some point during the day. And then over time, if kids see results themselves, they might be more inclined to increasing that time away from their phones or increasing that time away from social media. But this all said, if your teen just doesn't oblige and you're really concerned with how much they're using, you might need to try other techniques. Like you might need to put really firm boundaries and have family rules where you take something away. What I like better is actually incentivizing them to do things that you want them to do versus punishing. So saying that if you use social media this much less this week, then you earn points and you can cash those in for something else that you really want. So there's now that, I think it's called screen time on iPhones, that records how much time is spent on different apps. And that's like a really good way to monitor usage over time, where your teen can't just say, oh yeah, I use my Instagram less. You can actually say, all right, let's do your little screen time check-in and see how much you actually used it. Great, you actually went down 20% versus last week. You can now get such and such, which you've been asking me for the past couple of weeks. So you might want to just try these tips and strategies, but just start with a conversation and kind of understand what their experience is like.
Wonderful. That's super helpful, Neha, and that actually transitions well into the next category. So I think your advice in terms of some practical things that parents can do in the home regarding social media is very, very relevant here as well, because one of the themes that we saw was sort of this idea of it being a difficult time and behaviors are different during this time, and parents are trying to learn how to navigate. So in this family well-being section, we have two initial questions that are focused on remote learning. So the first is how to avoid further isolation when school in the fall is going to be distance learning and the child is a freshman in high school. And then the second question, how can I keep my student active in the fall once school goes back to remote learning?
So I think that the key here in navigating what's otherwise a very, very difficult time is to be really intentional, proactive, and creative. So if you wait for a kid to just organically make friends and stay connected or stay active, it's going to be really tough for them to do so in reality, as it's going to be tough for adults. I think this is not even teen or kid specific. And then not doing those things ends up having negative repercussions on everybody's mental health. So how to stay active and stay social really requires getting a little creative. And when we do have a little bit of open Q&A time at the end and or with the chat open, I'd love to hear from everybody in terms of what creative tips they have, like everybody has for each other in terms of how you're supporting your kids in staying connected to other people. So if you haven't already, you might want to think about things like contacting the school and working with a teacher to maybe have some offline or even during the school day social icebreakers and events and ways for kids to connect that they otherwise wouldn't necessarily have built into the school day if things were pre-COVID. And you may want to even schedule time to be social and schedule time for fun, as funny as that sounds. It's really easy right now for all of us to fall into a trap where every day looks exactly the same and you just think that fun will happen when it happens, and then it doesn't, right? It's like the weekdays, weekends, everything looks the same. But it might require doing things that seem a little bit unnatural, like setting up a family game night, for example. Even if your kids don't want to play, you'll model this idea of intentionally trying to have fun or to do something lighthearted, which can go a long way for them in their own social lives, because they might be rolling their eyes in real time, but then these things leave a positive impression on them because it sends the right message. You might want to try to encourage them to set up video hangouts with their friends at regular intervals, or schedule time to work out or go outside. Or maybe there's something active that or social that your teen can do even with the family if it's not with friends, because even socializing with other people can be good for and protective for mental health. I think there's something really stabilizing in doing consistent rituals. So doing something the same time every single day or the same day every week that can really be soothing and end up forming healthy habits that then kids can look forward to and then anticipate in a really healthy way.
Definitely. Some great advice there. The next two questions, again, are sort of grouped because they're both related to communication. So the first is how to communicate with teens, how to encourage them to share their feelings with parents. And then the second one is ways we can keep teens engaged and open with their communication.
These are excellent questions. So I tell every parent that you really want to start by meeting teens where they're at. And that means truly approaching the conversation with an open, curious mind, putting judgment aside and listening to their perspective on whatever it is that they want to talk about. So if you walk into a conversation with your ideas to share and without truly wanting to hear their ideas, they'll notice. And they'll take it as a force coming at them, and they're going to give you a force back. So if truly in your mind you go in wanting to learn from their perspective what their experience is, your own demeanor is going to change and so will theirs. So what you'll end up doing is creating an environment of something called psychological safety, which says, hey, I value you. I want to hear from you. I will not judge you. It's okay to be who you are, to do the things you do, think the way you think, and feel what you feel. And that's really what teens need in communication. I think that's what everybody needs in communication, to feel seen, heard, and be allowed to be themselves and have that safety. And if you can find a way to practice and strengthen that, you'll see the communication between you and your teen improve over time. In terms of how to keep teens engaged and open with communication, I would say the best advice is to just keep trying, even if it seems like it's not getting results. So some parents will say that they keep asking their kids how they're feeling and their kids don't respond, or they seem annoyed, or say, leave me alone, stop asking. But even though the teens might say that they want you to go away or leave them alone, in their hearts, they typically don't. They typically want you to keep asking because to them, it says that you care. So the second that you stop asking, even if they say, leave me alone, please stop. Why do you always ask this? When you stop, they feel it and they think, oh, why did mom or dad stop? Do they not care about me anymore? So they want to be able to push and push and push, but what they need is for you to keep pushing back, for you to keep saying, you can push all you want, you can ignore me all you want, but I'm still going to ask you because I still care about you. I still love you. I still hear you. I still see you. And just being present in that really, really consistent way works wonders for communication. And if that verbal, I just want to add one more thing. If that verbal communication doesn't work, I would try other forms. So I've had a lot of families who say that verbal communication is just too much. They're not used to talking openly about how they're feeling and what they're thinking. So they write notes to each other, or they jot down how they're feeling on a calendar that's available for everybody to see, because it's just less daunting than saying it out loud. So at the end of the day, you just want to do what works for your family, but just do it consistently. Keep doing it. keep trying.
That's great. This next question, Neha, is I think a difficult question to answer in addition to these communication ones, which is how to teach teens about controlling their emotions, anger, restlessness, etc.
This is a difficult one because teens typically have overactive, quote unquote, emotion centers in their brain. And their thinking centers, or kind of the front portion of their brain involved in decision making and rationality and judgment, is not fully formed until age 25. So the more that you can teach teens coping skills, the better they'll develop habits and ways, and almost like these little hacks to put the brakes on the emotion centers, the better. So some things that I suggest off the bat to everybody who's looking for some sort of in the moment coping skills when they kind of feel those emotions get away from them. So a lot of teens say that they recognize it in themselves. They're like, yeah, there's a moment where I'm feeling something and it's so intense and I know I can control it, but then it gets away from me. Then it goes too far and I lose control. And at that point I can't reel it back in. So in terms of what to do, what I tell teens is that to identify that early turning point. So when they first notice that they have that feeling rising, use a coping skill. Now, what do some of those coping skills look like? I would say some easy ones to try at home are music, like putting in headphones, having a playlist of songs that teens already like and they have ready to go so they're not searching for it. So putting in headphones and then just blasting that playlist, just setting it and forgetting it, pressing it on play. Or exercising, which sounds almost strange to do in the moment, but if you literally stop and do push-ups or do jumping jacks or something like that, it ends up releasing endorphins and neurotransmitters, both music and exercise, which act as natural antidepressants. There are a couple other things that you can do. Extreme temperature works too. I don't know if anybody has tried that, but I have teens who say they take a bowl of really cold water, put a couple ice cubes in it. And when they're feeling very, very strong emotions, they put one hand or both in the cold in the ice water and just kind of let it sit there for as long as they can tolerate it. And that temperature ends up almost kind of dampening the emotion centers. It does something with something called the autonomic nervous system that helps with the emotion centers. And then another thing that's really helpful, last big bucket of things, is writing, coloring, or scribbling. Writing could be journaling or writing down specific thoughts of how they're feeling, or they could just write anything they wanted. I mean, you could write the word words over and over and over again. Words, 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 words. There's something in that process of taking a pen to paper and scribbling, coloring, writing, and all the steps that your brain goes through that engages a different part of your brain than the part that's involved in these really, really intense emotions. So when this part starts working, because you've almost distracted your brain, the other part that's really emotional starts kind of quieting down. So you basically, you just want to try out a few different things, and then you'll get a sense of what works. Your teen will be able to say, you know, this doesn't really work for me, but this works really well. So I would say that's a good starting point.
That's great. The next question that we have, again, is about another transition in a kid life, but this one a little bit earlier. So, you know, why is it that kids in high school suddenly turn towards parents and look at us as if we don't understand or care for them, when these were the same kids in middle school that thought we were the best parents?
Oh, this is a great question because it's one that many parents have. And the truth is, this is developmentally normal. It's normal for your teen to rebel and to seemingly turn against their parents, because it's basically their way of saying, okay, I'm my own person now. I'm going to separate away from you and I'm going to form my own identity. But part of the issue is the teen's identity, even though they're moving away from their parents, ends up somehow merging with the identity of their peers, which is also somewhat developmentally normal for that age. But what typically happens on the other side of this, kind of in late teens, or I would say early 20s or so, early to mid 20s, depending on just how your child is doing developmentally. On the other side of this, they do then end up separating from their peers as well and really forming their own identity. At that point, they kind of turn back and they're like, oh yeah, hi mom and dad, sorry about earlier. So I would say, don't worry, because that phase is, again, developmentally normal, but it doesn't last forever.
Great. And then the last question here, my child says she is having trouble falling asleep at night. Do you have any suggestions for sleep?
So as we had noted in the presentation earlier, sleep disruptions can definitely be a sign of anxiety or depression or something more. So I would say if it's something new and pretty drastic and unusual, and especially paired with other symptoms, I would definitely recommend getting a professional evaluation. But some teens aren't great at sleep hygiene in general. So there are some things that you want to be mindful of. One is reducing stimulation. I would say probably the hour or so before bedtime. It's not a great time to be finishing up homework, which a lot of people are, or doing something really energetic or emotional or activating. Another is reducing daytime naps and or caffeine intake. So a lot of kids nap after school, or they might have a Diet Coke or something with a snack or over dinner. And I would definitely recommend against these because both can affect sleep. And then I would say lastly, and most importantly, no screen time before bed. And I think that one's difficult for probably everybody because we're so used to being on our phones all the time. But that light, even if it's put on a really dim setting, which it should be as you're kind of nearing bedtime, it sends a signal to your brain that looks like the sun, which tells the brain to be awake. So you really want to put your phones away. I would say the longer, the better. An hour is really good, or an hour is great. 45 minutes is good. 30 minutes is better than nothing. Otherwise, you're basically giving your body and your brain mixed messages to be awake and also go to sleep at the same time. So none of these work perfectly, but over time, if you try all of these in combination, some of them can help.
Great. Thank you, Neha. A lot of really valuable insights here. So now we are approaching the last topic section for this Q&A portion. Again, we had a lot of questions come in around this idea of how to support our teens. So the first question we have, Neha, is around a 15-year-old daughter who has anxiety. How can I convince her to see a counselor? And actually the second question as well, my son refuses to talk to counselors or take medications for anxiety and depression. He wants to solve it himself. What would you recommend to older teens to help them take charge of their mental health?
So this is definitely tough. I found that it's helpful for kids to understand that their anxiety or depression or whatever it is they're experiencing is just like any other medical illness for which people to seek help. And I would say that the brain is an organ just like anything else. And people can have genes that predispose them to getting these disorders the same way as they can get diabetes or asthma or something else like that. So once you talk about that, it's also helpful to normalize talking to a counselor or therapist. So mentioning and reminding the teen that there are a lot of other people with anxiety and that they're not alone and there are ways to get help. And then teens generally also like to know what to expect. So I would say that parents can do their research on what counseling looks like. Does it work? And here the answer is yes. So usually I think almost up to 2/3, I want to say, of kids with anxiety get better with therapy alone. They want to know things like, how often do I need to go to counseling? What happens if I don't? So kids also like knowing that they're not just subject to something that they're being told to do, but if they don't like something, that they have an option to potentially stop or to tell you and that you'll actually listen to them, or if they don't like their therapist, that they can try another one. And then I would say in terms of kids who are refusing treatment or think that they can solve it themselves, I would probably just directly ask them, like, if you broke your leg, would you try to solve that on your own? Or what if you got a really bad infection? What would you do then? And then just kind of lead into that conversation about mental health not being any different from physical health and not always being solvable alone in that way. And I found that it's also really helpful for teens to know that sometimes leaving depression and anxiety untreated can have longer term repercussions and also affect their brain. So the sooner that they get the treatment, the faster then they can get on top of what's going on and then move on with their lives. So for some teens, it ends up resonating when talking about it as a short-term investment in their own future so that they don't have to keep worrying about it later on.
That's great advice. This next question too is actually related to one of the pieces you covered, which was around this idea of a teen who has tried therapy and maybe had an experience that wasn't positive or wasn't helpful. How can you think about getting help for teens who fall into that category?
Yeah, so I would say if teens have tried therapy in the past and did not find it helpful, it's really important to figure out why. So usually it's a fit issue. Either they didn't have a good fit with their therapist, or the type of therapy that they did wasn't really a good fit for them, or whatever their condition is. So in terms of the former, that alliance that a patient has with a therapist is called a therapeutic alliance. That connection is responsible for, I want to say, at least 30% of why therapy works. So a lot of it is the content and what happens in the exchange of the therapy, but a lot of it is purely just that fit and connection. So if you've tried a therapist and it wasn't a good fit, I think it's definitely worth trying one again. And there are also several different types of therapies. Some are more structured, others are more unstructured. Even within the structured and unstructured buckets, there's several different types. So just because one type didn't work in the past doesn't mean that another one won't. So I would say, again, if something hasn't been a good fit in the past, it doesn't mean that it won't be in the future, and we just keep trying.
Great. What are resources in the area to sign my teenager up for counseling?
So the traditional brick and mortar resources, if you were looking for someone to go see in a clinic, what I would say is to, I guess, look at some of the major medical centers and their affiliated practices, look for private practitioners and group practices, or you can contact your insurance company to see who their in-network providers are. But you'd have to call them one by one. And as a lot of the insurance companies have lists that are really outdated, and a lot of people aren't taking patients anymore, or they have really long wait lists. The good thing is that there are new companies like Daybreak that are offering telehealth at really affordable prices, which is a completely new set of resources that candidly, I wish I could have referred my patients to for therapy a long time ago, the patients who I'm seeing for medication management. So there are options out there, and I think we're seeing a lot newer options than just what was traditionally there.
Yeah, that's great. The next question here would like to know if there are ways to get a one-on-one session with a counselor for my boy who is 16. And then actually the last question, how do I know if my teen is a good fit for your counseling services? So it seems like these are kind of more specific questions, about us. But what are ways to get one-on-one sessions, with counselors?
Yeah, so these are great questions. I think there's two parts here, especially to the last question, which I think will encompass the first one. That was, how do I know if my teen's a good fit for your counseling services? So one, how do I know my kid's a good fit for counseling to begin with? I personally think that anybody and everyone can benefit for therapy or counseling, but those who really, really need it are people with even mild symptoms. If the symptoms do persist for a few weeks or getting worse instead of better, or even if they're not around for very long, but they're really affecting the child's ability to function and get through their day in the way that they need to. So I really don't think that a child should suffer when there are ways to get early support. And usually what's important here to understand is that the earlier the intervention, the better the outlook or the prognosis for the kid. And the second part of this question was about fit for Daybreak services. So what I'll speak to is the telemedicine portion, because that's what Daybreak's offering. So a lot of families ask about telemedicine versus in-person for teens. And what I tell them is this: in terms of the literature out there, there are a lot of studies on the topic that show that digital therapy or teletherapy, telepsychiatry, et cetera, that whole big bucket, is comparable to in-person treatments. The outcome measures in terms of improvements in depression, improvements in anxiety, et cetera, are the same. In my personal practice, and what I've heard from colleagues is that while it can be harder to see younger kids via tele, because I can't just get down on the floor and play with them in the same way, I've actually found that teens are actually much more open to tele than even adults, and even my adult patients that I'm seeing. It's more familiar to them. They're using technology all the time. It's a lot more convenient. It's also less nerve-wracking and less disruptive to their lives and the other things they want to do than is, dropping everything to go see a provider in a clinic. And some teens actually feel like there's a level of anonymity, even though it's not really anonymous. They feel like, well, if you're on a screen and I'm on a screen, then we don't really know each other, and there's that little bit of distance there. And sometimes having that distance can actually help kids open up. Other kids say that within the first 30 seconds to a minute, they forget that they're on screen and actually feel similar to in person. So while it's not the same experience by any means, I would say that overall, It has its own set of pros and cons, and the outcomes of how kids do in teletherapy is similar to in-person. And it's just really convenient and really doable, especially in the middle of the pandemic. So with that, Alex, I'm actually going to turn over to you. Alex is the CEO of Daybreak, and he's going to share a little bit more about the services and what they're all about.
Thank you so much, Neha. And thanks to everyone for making the time this evening. What we're going to do now quickly is spend about 5 minutes talking about Daybreak Health Services, and then we're actually going to go switch back to an open discussion section for the remaining period, and we will stay here late if you all have additional questions for us or for Neha. And I've already seen some great questions coming in on the chat, so feel free to stick around for that as well. So what we just heard from Neha is that we know from a scientific standpoint and what the evidence says that telemedicine therapy is equally as effective as in-person therapy. And we also heard from Neha the importance of FIT and the Therapeutic Alliance. We heard about the different types of therapy and how those can fit different for different types of teens. And so what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is how Daybreak has redesigned online counseling, backed in that core evidence and that science that Neha talked about, but in a way that makes it infinitely better for teens as well as for parents. And so there's 5 things that we hear time and time again when it comes to our services that parents love and teens love that they haven't been able to find anywhere else. One is that all of our counselors are teen counselors. So all of our licensed clinicians are focused specifically on teens. That is what they do. And they can relate to your child because they do that. And that's something that's very rare to find, but we've made a concerted effort to ensure that all of our clinicians focus solely in their backgrounds on teens. 2 is we bring it online. We've talked a lot about this, but just to reinforce some of what Neha said, it's actually more engaging for teens, and we'll show you a little bit of how that's worked for us. And it's really convenient for you as a parent. 3rd, it's backed by science. So in addition to the baseline that we know that telemedicine is as effective as in-person care, we've also designed a program around our telemedicine that includes not just those individual sessions with a counselor, but also messaging, as well as additional well-being tools and groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that whole program is backed by experts like Neha and others at UCSF in terms of its ability to really impact change. 4th is the parent partnership. So this is so important. And from anything from parent education, like we're doing right now, all the way through to from the first moment with Daybreak, having an assigned guide who is yours and help you navigate the system, navigate insurance and more. And then on an ongoing basis, keeping you updated on your child's treatment. Our big priority is working with parents and partnering with parents to communicate and support you along the journey. And then lastly, it's affordable. Because we've brought services online, we're able to maintain the quality of care and hire the best clinicians, but simply because we're not spending money on real estate, we're able to offer those services at a much lower price point. So you're able to get the same or better quality care and clinicians at about half the cost of private practice. In terms of the results that we've seen so far, I just want to mention 3 quick things. 1, teens love it. So we see 90% session attendance, which when you think about the average for this industry, which is closer to 70%, is a big indication that teens are enjoying the service and they find it more accessible. They're able to access it more easily and they're showing up more often. In addition to that, what's even more surprising and great is that teens are actually engaging 2 to 3 times a week on the messaging platform to talk with their counselors. And this gives our parents a lot of peace of mind because they know it's not just a once a week thing. It's that their child can reach out to the counselor whenever they need, and they'll get a response within 24 hours. All that leads to parents loving it as well. We have a satisfaction rating of 5 out of 5 on average from our parents. And lastly, I would say it works. we measure the clinical standards, as Neha was speaking about, around standard anxiety and depression measures, and those improve with our services, and they're directly correlated with changes in behavior and mood as well. But you don't have to take it from us. We did want to share one testimonial from a high school mother. This is a mother who is at Archbishop Midi. Her son is class of 2021, and I know a few of you today have joined us from Midi. So thank you for being here. And I just wanted to read sort of the testimonial she gave us to share this evening. So she says, "It's so quick and convenient. I don't have to deal with all the insurance headaches. It gives me peace of mind. He has someone to talk to, and that he can keep in touch with messaging." So I just wanted to share that quickly in terms of the impact that we're having on real people. And thanks to the mother who shared that testimonial. All right, in terms of how it works, we make it really easy. So the first step, if you decide after this session that you'd like to start with us, is we'll do a free wellness check. And what I want you to think about here is, I want you to think about the wellness check as the equivalent of an emotional fitness check, just the same as you would go in for a physical on an annual basis. So we would do a call with you and your team to understand emotional well-being, needs, and goals. And then if it's appropriate, we can move forward to working with Daybreak. But even if it's not, you'll leave that session with very valuable information around the emotional well-being of your child. We're also happy to help you prepare your team for that wellness check. So our concierge, our guides can help you with a little bit of how do you actually convince your team to hop on the phone for the first time? As we've seen a couple of questions tonight, we often see those questions from parents around how do you speak with your teen, your child, about getting on the phone in the first place. After the wellness check, you'll design your plan together with us. So based on the goals that you laid out, you and your teen together, we will put together a plan for how counseling can help your teen. And that will usually include our full coverage, which is an $89 a week plan, and includes a weekly session with your therapist, the ability to message them on a daily basis, and then also optional group sessions organized for groups of multiple teens, usually 4 to 8, around topics like school stress or mindfulness. So that's a nice complement to the individualized plans that we set up. And then lastly, we do this really quickly and we personalize it. So right after your wellness check and you've chosen your plan, we guarantee that we'll get you a next day match to a personalized counselor based on what we've learned. And we guarantee that match. So the last thing I'll say here today is, if this sounds like a good fit for you and your child, please get started with a wellness check today. Again, think about it as a physical that you would go in for on an annual basis. If you're noticing any of the following or any of the symptoms that we talked about earlier, even if it's only been occurring for a couple of weeks, as Neha mentioned, it's worth getting that wellness check sooner rather than later. So you can reach us on our website, daybreakhealth.com, and you can chat directly with us there, or get started and fill out a form to schedule your wellness check.
Great, thanks, Alex.